Hey everyone, welcome back to Architecture 5610. At the end of the last video, I made this directional light, but I didn't talk about it too much. So one of the things I just want to point out is that I have this set up where it's at an angle that's not quite like parallel to any angular objects that I have in my 3D model. One of the things you want to watch out for is you just don't want to accidentally have all of the shadows that your light will create or cast just end up being directly underneath the objects that you're rendering. So if I go to the 3D view, you'll see that these things are kind of floating, and so when I create this rendering, I'll have a shadow cast at some kind of angle downward from here. If I had this directional light directly over top, then I wouldn't really be able to see the shadow. It would be underneath the object. So you just want to mess around with the angle and see what works best for your composition. And then what you can also do is you can jump over to the rendered viewport. So if you do the drop down underneath the shaded viewport button, you can go to the rendered viewport, and now you can see your materials. They're all applied, but you'll notice that you can't see my directional light, and also you don't really see where the shadows are. There's just kind of a gradient happening, but not anything very sharp. So you'll notice that is actually because of the skylight that is built into Rhino. So if you go to the Render Tools tab and click this light bulb button, there is the sun, the skylight, and the V-Ray directional light. So the V-Ray directional light is really what I want to use. The skylight is there really just to illuminate generally the things that I see within Rhino. If I turn this off, you'll see it gets really dark. You might be able to compensate that by changing this to a higher number and see what happens. So now I set that to 3, and now we have a much more intense, bright directional light. And we have no skylight turned on. We can see what it looks like if we turn that back on. Now everything's a little bit more washed out, and that might not be what we want. So you can play around and mess with these things, but I had this set to 0.2, I believe. And then I had the skylight turned off, and then we can actually control, much like a camera, you can control V-Ray, which is the rendering plugin that we're going to use in Rhino. So I'm just going to run a test here and turn the skylight off and have this very low intensity directional light, and we'll see what we end up with. So I'm going to close that. And if you're about to render in Rhino, you always want to double check and make sure that under the render drop down and then over to current renderer, you want to see whether you're in Rhino render or if you're in the V-Ray for Rhino. So I'm in V-Ray for Rhino Legacy. You might see that if you have a file that was started in an older version of Rhino. But so I have V-Ray for Rhino turned on, and then I'm going to go to this asset editor button under V-Ray. And here's the window that it just opened up. So you'll see I have this V-Ray directional light. I have the Rhino document set to 0, and then if you want to open up these little side bars, you just hit the arrows. Materials will be over here, and this is asking us about the material library, so you can download materials. But we're mostly concerned with lights for today, so I'm in this window under this light icon. Under this light icon, we have the V-Ray directional light set to 20, and we can edit this, but we can also go over here to the settings with the gear icon, and then we can see what our current rendering engine is. So the engine being what computer component is being used. So the CPU is always a good bet. If you have like a really fancy computer, you might be using the graphics card, which would be one of these two. And then I have it set to high quality right now, and I have the denoiser turned on. And then we can go down to camera. This is going to be very useful. So this exposure value, it's always confusing because I always want to forget that the higher number is going to be darker, and then the lower the number here is going to be brighter. So if I made that -15, like it's suggesting is the minimum, versus 25, it would be lighter or darker. So we'll leave that at 10 and we will test this render. Depth of field is kind of about like lens blur and stuff that you might get if you are looking at objects of various distance away. So things that are very near to the camera might be blurry, or things that are farther away might be very blurry. And then there is a focus source that you can set and focus distance, but we don't need any of that. So just turn that off for this project. But in like a deeper architectural render, you might end up wanting to turn that on. So under effects, we have vignetting, vertical lens tilt, and then we also have render output. This is an important one. So we have the image height and width here. So the width is this 3840 for me right now. It says there's a min and max of something enormous, and the default is 800. So I have this set to this number because that's essentially a 4K aspect ratio, and then, or pixel density of a 4K image at 16:9 aspect ratio. So you can also change this, and you can change those numbers. So if you're doing like a practice run of your render and you want to change that to 1000, you could change that, and then you could also hit Control Z to undo that. But you know, I would just write these numbers down so you don't forget. But it'll actually automatically correct the other one to match this aspect ratio. So I'm just going to hit Control Z. There we go. And you can also set where it will default save the image. I am usually just going to hit the save button as I do the rendering. So now I'm just going to close out of this window and we'll test this render. So I'm going to go to top view, and I'm going to select my model. I'm going to type in ZSA and zoom in on it, so that way it fills my entire screen, because your screen space will be the actual size of the rendering. So if you're way out here and then this is the thing you want to render, but you render from all the way zoomed out, you'll end up where you have all this dead white space, and then the actual image that you wanted to render will be very small relative to what you rendered. So make sure you're zooming in on what you want to render, and then you can hit this render preview button to run a kind of faster version of the render, or you can press this render button here for the more official thing. So I'm hitting render, and you can see that it's getting it's already like very bright, and the two colors are kind of shifted from what I expected them to be. So I'm going to stop this now with that stop button. If you close out of this without hitting stop button, there's a habit that Rhino has where this will freeze. So I just kind of always make sure I press the stop button or the abort render button. And now I'm going to go into my lights here and see what this setting is set to. And I believe it was actually 0.02. And I'll hit enter, and I'll just try this render again real quick, only changing that intensity. And now we can see that this is a little bit more natural looking. My kind of orangey color and my blue color are a nice kind of what I expected them to look like coming from Illustrator. So that's good, but we could stop this, and we can close that, and we can go back to that Vray asset editor, and we could change this exposure value incrementally, just increase it or decrease it to get that brightness to the right level. You can also mess with the white balance. I usually just make sure that it's on white. And then you can also just kind of verify these other options here. Animation we're not using. Environment, I would just leave this with the defaults. Material override, you definitely want to leave that off because you have a very specific material that you're using. And swarm, again, we're not going to mess with this right now. But that's essentially it for this window. But you could come in here and keep editing these lights, and you could go back to the camera and change that exposure value. And we might be able to see information about the shadows that we're going to be casting. If you go into the lights tab and then click on your light, you'll get this window off to the side, which says parameters. It says the color, the intensity, the shadow radius. Shadows are turned on, the diffuse and specular options. You can mess with those and see what they do, but I think generally just running with the defaults for this project is going to be best. So I'm just going to close this, and I'm going to hit that render button again and let this go. So what you'll see about Vray is that it's a slow process. So it says rendering image down here. Eventually this will say finished, and I'll be able to save this. You can potentially save it early, but you just have to realize that it is going to take a while. So a lot of times I'll start a render and then I'll go get a cup of coffee or whatever, work on something else, do some sketches or something. But so you can hit save, and then you can just save this file. You'll want to open it up, or you'll want to save it somewhere that you can find it very easily. So I would just like save it to your desktop or a folder that you know you can access. And then a PNG is a good file type to use. If you use JPEG, you'll definitely have that white background that we were seeing all through here. If you use a PNG, that background will be transparent. So I'm just gonna save this as a test render under PNG and hit save. Here we go. So I'm just saving this a little early, but you'll definitely want to let this continue to process. And then when it's done, you'll save it. So next you'll want to open up Photoshop. So I'm opening Photoshop now, and when this opens up, I'll just have to pick my image, and here we go. So hit open, find that image you're looking for, and here we go. So I'm going to open that, and it will give me actually a really nice thing that is these rulers will show you how large the image is. If you right click, you can change the units of these rulers, and if you're not seeing the rulers right now, I think it's under view and then rulers here, or Control R. But so you can go to right click and hit pixels, and then it'll change the unit from the inches that it was showing to pixels. But that's always a really useful tool, because essentially Photoshop will tell you what size of a piece of paper you could print this image on without it like having to compress or stretch in order to fit there. So really all we're doing here in Photoshop is using the crop tool. So it's just these kind of two corners of a frame. You're probably already familiar with that icon. And then right now it's trying to make this into a square. I would just kind of clear that with the button that says clear, and then you'll be able to snap this. Actually, for some reason I didn't want to do it at first, but it will snap to the edges of the actual image. Photoshop is aware of what is the background and what is the actual image itself when it's a PNG. If it was a JPEG, it would not be aware of that. So I'm just cropping this image to just the extents of the image itself, deleting that background and hitting the check mark for OK and accepting that. And now I have my final image. While you're in Photoshop, you can also start exploring. It's similar to Illustrator in that you can hit this plus button here and you can make layers. You can click the eyeball button and that'll turn the visibility of that on or off. You can use the lock button to lock whatever layer is selected. And then you can use the paint bucket tool. You can select things, and there's a polygonal lasso tool that's good to play with, and the pen tool. There's a lot in here, very powerful software that we'll get into a little bit more in detail later this semester. So, okay, that's it for this video. Thanks, guys.